The White Witch of Rose Hall. Episode 2 of 6. The Mistress. Rose Hall Plantation, Montego Bay, Jamaica, 1825. Rose Hall Great House, Montego Bay, Jamaica, where the cane fields breathe at night and the mistress keeps her own hours. Certain memories remain with painful precision, while larger events fade. The date of the solicitor's examinations is gone. The weather on the morning of departure from Portsmouth is gone. But the weight and temperature of Annie Palmer's hand at the dinner table of Rose Hall remained clear, as if those two heartbeats had been preserved untouched by time. Her fingers were cool despite the Jamaican heat that had soaked into every stone of the house, every board of the floor, every thread of the shirt collar. Cool and exact, like a scalpel. She touched for no more than 2 seconds, yet the feeling of each finger seemed to linger long after she withdrew her hand. After midnight, drumming rose from the cane fields, deep, low, and rhythmic, seeming to come from the ground itself rather than the air. In the mirror above the washstand, a shape appeared and vanished before certainty could form. Rum, strangeness, a new hemisphere, candlelight. Each explanation was offered in the dark, and none of them truly held. This is where episode 2 begins. Chapter 1. Morning after. Morning came in white light. Not the tired gray of London, creeping apologetically beneath curtains, but the full, declarative white of a Caribbean dawn. It entered the east-facing guest room like an announcement and found Robert still in his clothes, as if he had sat on the edge of the bed after midnight and abandoned the effort of staying awake. He sat up with a dry mouth and a badly creased jacket. On the washstand, the candle had guttered and gone cold. The mirror showed a man far less composed than he had tried to appear at dinner the evening before. He remained before the mirror longer than necessary, uncertain what he hoped to find. The shape from the night before was gone. Only his own reflection stared back, disheveled, pale, and determined to be rational in a place that had offered him no rational foothold. He washed, dressed properly, and rehearsed his explanations. Annie Palmer was a widow, and widows were not supernatural. The drumming was likely ritual, labor, or some unknown feature of Jamaican nights. The mirror had caught a trick of candlelight. Her hand on his had been nothing more than a hostess's welcome. He repeated that final explanation because it was the one that needed the most work. Robert came down to breakfast at 7:30. The great house of Rose Hall was almost entirely silent, not the comfortable silence of a house at rest, but something subtler and less reassuring. A silence with a tension in it, as though the house itself was listening. Morning light came through the tall windows of the lower hall and struck the polished mahogany floors in long golden bars, while dust motes drifted so slowly they seemed suspended in amber. The dining room had been laid for one plate, one cup, one precisely folded linen napkin. Annie Palmer's chair at the head of the table was empty. The chair across from where Robert had sat the night before was empty as well. There was no sound from the kitchen, no sound from anywhere. He sat down and felt, acutely, the peculiar vulnerability of a man eating alone in a room built for ceremony. Mabel appeared without announcement, without the sound of footsteps, materializing at the edge of attention as though she had been there all along. She set a plate before him, thick bread, fruit, and salt fish with ackee that smelled extraordinary. She filled his cup. She did not speak. As she reached past him to adjust the cup, Robert noticed the charm on her left wrist, a small bundle, barely larger than a fig, tied with red thread. Dried herbs were wound tight around something dark pressed into the center. It had not been there the night before. He was certain of that. Robert called Mabel's name as she turned to leave. She stopped without looking back, which felt like an answer in itself. He asked about the charm on her wrist. A long pause followed. Mabel turned slowly, with the deliberate economy of movement that marked everything she did. Her still, Measuring eyes held his, and in them he read something unexpected. Not offense, not suspicion, but something closer to pity. The particular pity one might feel for a man standing on ice that had already begun to crack, who had not yet heard the sound. Mabel answered with one word: protection. When he asked what it protected her from, her eyes held his. In that house, she said, everyone needed protection, everyone except the mistress. Then she left. Robert ate. The ackee was extraordinary, as noted before. He tasted almost none of it. After breakfast, he went to work. He had come to Rose Hall for a reason, ostensibly to review the estate's commercial affairs and provide legal counsel on matters of property transfer. He had papers. He had ledgers. He had a professional purpose that, after one extraordinary dinner and one appalling night, had begun to feel translucent, like a stage flat with the stagehands visible behind it. Still, he went to the study, sat down, opened the ledgers, and behaved like a man of reason. The estate's financial records were thorough, meticulously kept in a hand he did not recognize. Not Annie Palmer's sharp angular script, but something more careful, more clerical, and more frightened. The accounts of sugar production, export figures, and the cost of maintaining the mill and the great house were orderly and well maintained, the records of a prosperous operation. It was the secondary columns that stopped him. Payments to unnamed persons appeared as initials or symbols he could not decode. Expenses were logged only as night work, with no materials, hours, or tasks recorded. Then came the column he returned to again and again, as curiosity slowly curdled into something colder. Deaths. Recorded in the same careful, frightened hand as everything else. Dates and a mark, a small cross, drawn very small, as though the writer had not wanted to commit too much ink to it. One every 6 to 8 months over the past 4 years. Always among the enslaved workforce. Always marked simply as expired, cause undetermined. No disease recorded. No accident described. No inquest. Just the date, the cross, and the silence. Too regular. That was what disturbed him most, not only the number, though the number was too high, but the interval. Disease does not keep appointments. Accident does not observe a schedule. Whatever had caused those deaths had occurred with the quiet regularity of a quarterly report. Robert closed the ledger and set his hands flat on the cover. Beyond the window, the sugarcane spread in magnificent acres, swaying in the sea wind off Montego Bay, brilliant in the morning light, green and silver and indifferent. Beautiful. Completely, serenely, staggeringly beautiful. And somewhere within it, whatever made those crosses necessary was still going on. For the first time, clearly and without the fog of novelty or Annie Palmer's proximity, true fear took shape. Not the Gothic shiver of a man who has heard a strange sound in the night. Something more serious. The cold, measured fear of a man who has looked at numbers, understood what they are saying, and disliked the conclusion entirely. Chapter 2. The Garden and the Knife. Robert needed air, the kind of clarity that comes only from moving through space, from the mechanical comfort of placing one foot before the other on ground that is at least physically solid, whatever else might be uncertain about it. He left the study, left the ledgers and their terrible little crosses, and passed through the lower hall to a rear door of the great house that opened onto the walled garden. The walled garden of Rose Hall was the most extraordinary space he had ever entered. He had walked through the halls of the Inns of Court, the galleries of the British Museum, and the nave of Exeter Cathedral during a thunderstorm. Those places had grandeur, the grandeur of things made deliberately magnificent, things that announced themselves as worthy of attention. The walled garden announced nothing. It simply was, and in simply being, it overwhelmed. The walls were old stone, built from the same coral and limestone as the great house itself, and vines had claimed them so thoroughly that in places the stone had disappeared beneath decades of green. Within the walls, cultivation and wildness held one another in tension. Formal beds of herbs and flowers arranged in geometric patterns, now crowded, overgrown, and tangled at the edges where no one had cut them back. Bougainvillea climbed in violet magenta cascades. Ginger lilies stood in white clusters, their scent so strong in the mid-morning heat that it seemed almost heavy. Beneath it lay something darker, green and loamy and very old, like a thing that had been growing in the dark for a long time. Annie Palmer stood at the far end of the garden. Robert saw her before she turned, before she could have known he was there, or at least before she showed any sign of knowing, which was not necessarily the same thing at Rose Hall. She was bent slightly forward at a low stone planting table, working. The silver knife in her hand caught the sun before he saw anything else, a single bright point of reflected light in all that green. Then he saw the rest. She was dressed simply, more simply than he would have thought her capable of. Pale linen, unadorned, with the sleeves pushed to the elbows. Her hair was unbound, falling across one shoulder in a dense dark wave. No crimson. No jewels. No snake ring. Her hands were bare except for the knife. In that first unguarded moment, she looked almost completely human, a woman cutting flowers on a warm Jamaican morning, and nothing more complicated than that. Almost. Even bent at work, there was a quality to her stillness, a precise economy, an absence of the small unnecessary movements that belong to people who have not learned to be watched. Annie had learned. She was always performing composure, even when she believed herself alone. Perhaps especially then. She heard him on the path, the gravel giving him away, and turned without startlement, as though she had been expecting him since slightly before he decided to come outside. She acknowledged him by name, not quite as a greeting, but as confirmation of a prediction. Then she observed that he had slept badly. It was not a question. Robert had no idea how she knew. He had dressed carefully, and his face, he believed, was composed. But she stated it as fact, and, because it was fact, he found he did not want to pretend otherwise. He blamed the heat, the unfamiliar surroundings, and the difficulty of adjusting to a place so far from everything he knew. Annie repeated his explanation with the faintest smile, not mocking, but aware, and returned her attention to the flowers. The knife moved with calm precision. She suggested that in time he might stop noticing the heat, or that the heat might cause him to stop noticing other things first. Robert walked farther into the garden because remaining at the entrance felt too much like cowardice. He stopped at a reasonable distance, close enough for conversation, far enough for the pretense of formality, and asked about Haiti. Annie confirmed that she had grown up there, and when he suggested that it must have been very different from Rose Hall, she paused. She set down several cut stems and tilted her head slightly, deciding how much to give him. A small portion of truth, apparently, would be enough. She told him that her mother had smelled of jasmine, the same jasmine growing in the garden. When she first came to Rose Hall, she planted it along the south wall because she wanted to remember her mother by it. Now, she said, she could not always tell whether she was remembering her mother or smelling the garden. The knife continued its work, steady and unhurried. Her mother, Annie explained, spoke to spirits as naturally as other women spoke to neighbors. Sometimes she would set a place at the table for someone who was not visibly there, speak to that place while she cooked, and listen for whatever answered. Annie had thought every mother did this until she was old enough to know better. When Robert asked about her father, Annie answered with one simple, final word: he left. After that, there had been a woman who raised her, a teacher, in her way, who had studied things most people preferred not to know existed. That woman taught Annie that the world has two faces, and that only fools spend their whole lives looking at the one in the light. The garden held the heat and silence in equal measure. Something moved in the bougainvillea, a bird, perhaps, or simply the wind. Robert became aware that he had been holding back the question he truly wanted to ask, and that there was no graceful way to approach it. So he asked what had happened to Annie Palmer's husbands. Annie stilled. It was not a flinch, nothing so involuntary as that, but a deliberate stillness, like a held note. Slowly, she turned the silver knife over in her fingers, watching the sunlight run along the blade. Then, with no visible guilt and no defensive coloring at all, she said they had disappointed her. The answer carried no weight, no sorrow, and no explanation. It was offered the way one might note that a particular vintage of wine had not been worth ordering. Mild, certain, final. Then she smiled. It was not the warm smile of a woman being charming, nor the cold smile of a woman being cruel. It was something else entirely, the smile of something that had closed quietly around its prey and was in no hurry about it. She reached across the table and offered him a single white flower, freshly cut, its stem still beaded with sap and its petals startlingly bright in the morning light. She told him not to look so alarmed. She did not disappoint easily, she said, and neither, she suspected, did he. Robert took the flower. What else could he do? He held it and looked at her while she looked back, and for a moment that lasted slightly longer than all the moments before it combined, there was nothing in the walled garden but heat, jasmine, and the weight of whatever was happening between them. It was not courtship. It was not threat. It was some third thing for which he did not have a word in English, though he suspected she had one in several languages. He excused himself and walked back through the garden, through the rear door of the great house, and up the stairs to his room. He set the white flower on the writing desk by the window, sat down, and considered the word disappoint with extraordinary, useless clarity and what it might mean to a woman who had lost 3 husbands to it. 20 minutes later, he looked at the flower again. It had wilted completely. The petals had gone soft and translucent, curling inward, the stem limp on the desk, as if it had been cut a week ago and left in the sun. But it had been freshly cut 20 minutes before, by a silver knife in Annie Palmer's hand, in a walled garden that smelled of jasmine and something older than jasmine. Robert stared at it for a long time. Then he covered it with a blank sheet of paper and went downstairs. Chapter 3. Celeste speaks. The afternoon brought the kind of heat that made thought difficult and movement merely theoretical. The sea wind that had freshened the morning was gone, retreated to wherever sea winds go when they are finished, and in its absence the air over Rose Hall became a solid, pressing thing, warm, heavy, and absolutely still. The cane fields shimmered at their edges. The sky above them was an indifferent, burning blue. Robert found Celeste in the rear courtyard, at the long stone washing table near the well. She was working through a pile of linens, the great white sheets and table linens of the house, with rhythmic, efficient labor, plunging them into the wash water and pressing them against the board with capable hands. She was singing something low under her breath, barely audible, more breath than voice, and she stopped when she heard him on the courtyard stones. He had met Celeste the day before, briefly, on his arrival, a young woman, perhaps 20, with a quality of warmth that was all the more striking for the effort it clearly cost her in this place, where warmth seemed an act of quiet resistance. She had been guarded then. She had run the first time. She did not run now. She watched him approach with careful eyes, set her work to one side, and waited. Robert gestured toward the low stone bench at the side of the courtyard and asked permission to sit. A fractional pause followed. A decision seemed to pass behind those careful eyes. Then Celeste gave a small nod, not enthusiastic, but genuine. Robert sat. Celeste returned to her work, though she kept her attention on him, sidelong and aware. He asked whether she had been at Rose Hall long. Celeste answered that she had been there long enough, all the life she could remember, and that her mother had been there before her. When Robert realized she had known the estate before Mrs. Palmer came, Celeste confirmed it. She had been a child then, but she remembered Rose Hall before Annie. Robert asked if it had been different. Celeste stopped working and looked at him for a long moment, not with the evasive look of someone deciding what to conceal, but with the considering look of someone deciding how much he could bear to hear. There was kindness in it, which somehow made it worse. She said it had been different the way a lamp is different from a fire. A lamp can go out. A fire does not care. Then she returned to the linen, though her voice had changed, quieter, lower, closer to the edge of something. Celeste told him what she knew. Not everything, as she spoke. The shape of the things she was not saying seemed almost as clear as the things she was. But she told him enough. Annie Palmer had come to Rose Hall 12 years earlier as the bride of John Palmer, a planter of moderate wealth and optimistic disposition. He had met her somewhere in the islands, the story varied depending on who told it, and had brought her back to the great house with the infatuated certainty of a man who has acquired the most beautiful and impressive object he has ever encountered and does not yet understand that some objects are not meant to be owned. Within a year, John Palmer was dead. No sickness anyone could name. He had simply faded, growing thin, confused, and unable to tell where he was. At the end, they said he called for his mother in the night, and by morning he was cold. Nobody who had been there spoke about what they had seen. They still did not. Robert asked about the second husband. Celeste named him as Mr. Rollins, a merchant from Kingston, older, self-important, and foolish enough to think he could manage Annie Palmer. They found him in the cane field. There was no mark on him, nothing broken, nothing cut. The field hands discovered him at first light, lying on his back between the rows, eyes open to the sky. His face, Celeste said after stopping once and beginning again, was fixed in an expression of absolute terror, like a man who had seen something at the last moment that remained the last thing he would ever see. The courtyard was very quiet. Water dripped from the linen Celeste had lifted from the basin. Somewhere in the middle distance, a bird called once and was answered by nothing. Robert began to ask whether the people believed Annie had done it, then stopped himself and asked instead what they believed. Celeste answered flatly, as one states the color of the sky. They believed Annie could not be killed. They believed she had made a bargain, giving what most people cannot give and receiving what most people cannot receive, power over living things and power over the dark things that move between living things. Then Celeste looked at Robert directly, for the first time without deflection, and said they believed Taku was the only one who knew how to undo it. Robert asked why Taku had not done so already. Silence followed, long, full silence, like a held breath before a door is opened. Celeste began with the last man who tried, then corrected herself with care. Robert's predecessor, Mr. Dunmore, the solicitor who had come before him, had asked the same kind of questions Robert was asking. He had gone to Taku. He had been told things. Then he had acted on what he was told without understanding it properly, without the knowledge behind the knowing. Robert asked what had happened to him. They found Dunmore 3 days later in the old chapel on the hill, the ruined one past the eastern boundary of the estate. He was sitting upright in one of the pews, perfectly still, in the posture of a man at Sunday worship. There was not a mark on him anywhere. His hands were folded in his lap. But his hair, which had been brown when he came to Rose Hall, had gone entirely white, every strand, as though whatever he had seen, or whatever had been done to him, had burned the color out of it completely in the space of 3 days. Robert said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. Celeste picked up the linen again and returned to her work, pressing it against the board with capable hands, rhythmic and steady, as though the conversation could be set down and returned to its ordinary context as easily as a piece of washing. Robert sat a while longer. The sun moved. The light in the courtyard shifted from white to gold and began, very slowly, to thicken toward afternoon. Water sounded against the stone of the basin. Celeste worked. And the shape of what she had not said, the warning threaded through every word, present in every pause and careful rephrasing, filled the silence between them like a held breath. Like a breath that the afternoon at Rose Hall was in no hurry whatsoever to release. Chapter 4. The Invitation. Evening came to Rose Hall the way it always came to the Caribbean, not with the gradual, apologetic diminishment of a northern twilight, but with a kind of decisiveness. One moment the light was gold and full, and the sky was still the blue of deep afternoon. The next, without apparent transition, the west was burning crimson. The shadows had become actual darkness. And somewhere in the cane the first night insects had begun their enormous sound, a wall of it, intimate and relentless. Robert spent the latter part of the afternoon in his room, attempting to compose a report for his firm in London. The report was meant to detail his initial assessment of Rose Hall's legal and commercial position. He wrote 4 sentences. He crossed out 3 of them. The 4th, the estate is in sound financial order, was technically accurate and told approximately 1/10 of what he had learned, which made it, in the most fundamental professional sense, a lie. He crossed that out too and stared at the blank page for a while. Mabel brought the note at 8 o'clock precisely. She appeared at Robert's door, which he had not heard open, and extended a small silver tray without expression or comment, the way one might extend a tray containing a cup of tea, a glass of water, or some other perfectly ordinary thing. On the tray was an envelope of heavy cream paper, sealed with black wax, not a seal he recognized, not the Palmer family crest, but something else, a small circular impression he could not make out clearly in the evening candlelight. She left as silently as she had come. Robert stood holding the envelope for a moment before opening it. It was a notable envelope, with a weight that seemed disproportionate to its size, or perhaps he was projecting weight onto it, the weight of everything he knew about who had sent it. Inside was a single sheet of the same cream paper, dense with Annie Palmer's handwriting. The script was exactly as Robert might have imagined it, though he had not seen it before, sharp, angular, elegant, with no wasted motion in it whatsoever. The letters did not lean in any direction. They stood perfectly upright, as though they had been trained to, as though leaning was a weakness that would not be tolerated. Annie Palmer, written note, delivered by hand. I find I require company tonight. Come to the upper study at 9. Wear something comfortable. We shall not be standing on ceremony. A.P. Robert read it once. He read it again. He read it a 3rd time in case the second reading had introduced an ambiguity that the 3rd might resolve. It did not. He read it a 4th time simply because he had not yet decided what to do with it, and reading it again was a way of not deciding for a few more seconds, while the candle burned and the night insects sang their enormous, indifferent song outside the shuttered window. She required company. Robert was, apparently, the nearest available candidate for that requirement, the only Englishman on the estate, the only guest, the only person in the house whose presence was both voluntary and, in the practical sense, temporary. Temporary. He held that word in mind. He had come to conduct a legal review. He would leave when it was done. He was a temporary presence at Rose Hall, no more and no less. He opened his journal. He uncapped his pen. Then he wrote as precisely and clearly as he could manage. From the Journal of Robert Ashworth, Rose Hall, Jamaica. She is the most dangerous thing I have ever been in proximity to. I know this the way one knows a cliff edge, not from reason, not from any chain of inference or deduction, but from some older, animal part of the brain that was formed before reason was, that has survived because it knows things reason is too slow to know. Every instinct I possess is registering danger. The ledger, the charm on Mabel's wrist, Dunmore's white hair, they are all data, and the data has a conclusion, and I am quite clear-eyed about what that conclusion is. And yet I am putting on my good jacket. He put on his good jacket. He left his room at 5 to 9. The great house of Rose Hall at night was something else entirely from the great house in daylight. In the day, it was merely large and slightly overbearing, impressive in the conventional colonial manner, with its high ceilings and wide halls, and the quality of a place that has accumulated authority slowly over generations of wealth. At night, it became something the daylight version was only a cover story for. The candles that lit the hall sconces were placed too far apart for comfort, and between their circles of warm light, the darkness of the corridors was absolute. It had a depth that seemed greater than the physical space could account for. The portraits along the upper staircase wall, Palmer ancestors, solemn and formal in heavy gilt frames, became entirely different creatures in candlelight. They seemed to track movement. Robert told himself the sensation was caused by candlelight playing on painted eyes. He walked a little faster. The smell of the house at night was different too. Beneath the beeswax of the candles and the pervasive sweetness of the tropical air was something else. Jasmine, yes, always jasmine, but beneath it something darker and more complex. Sandalwood, smoke, and something Robert could not name. Though later any scent resembling it would bring a cold and immediate dread. Robert reached the upper study door at 9 o'clock precisely. He stood before it, raised his hand, knocked 3 times, and waited. From within came Annie Palmer's voice, clear, unhurried, warm in the way of a thing that has decided to be warm, which is not the same as warmth, but does its work all the same. She told Mr. Ashworth to come in. Robert went in. Chapter 5. The Upper Study. Robert had not known what to expect. Over the preceding hours, he had formed several working hypotheses about the nature of the upper study of Rose Hall, some practical, some Gothic, all of them inadequate. Nothing in his preparation had produced the room he actually walked into, which was perhaps the most unsettling thing that could be said about it. It was a library. That was the first and most fundamental fact of it. 3 of the 4 walls were shelved from floor to nearly ceiling, not the austere, ordered shelving of a gentleman's study or a lawyer's office, where books are arranged by subject and spine and stand at attention for inspection, but the dense, lived-in shelving of a person who actually reads. Books leaned against books. Books lay horizontal atop upright rows. Books were marked with ribbons, press leaves, or slips of paper covered in writing. French, English, Latin, Haitian Creole. Other languages Robert could not immediately identify, something that might have been a West African script, something with Arabic characters, and something unfamiliar that seemed to use symbols rather than letters. Between and around the books stood objects, a carved wooden figure, perhaps 8 inches tall, with a posture of startling authority, a glass bottle stoppered with wax, filled with a dark, iridescent liquid that moved too slowly when the bottle shifted. A bird's skull with tiny mirrors set into the eye sockets, throwing bright points of candlelight across the walls, older, more elaborate bundles like the one Mabel wore at her wrist, hanging from a shelf-edge hook, and a deck of playing cards. Face down, held with a black ribbon. And Annie Palmer. She sat in a low-cushioned chair near the window, the kind chosen because it is genuinely comfortable rather than because it presents well. She was barefoot, which struck Robert disproportionately, the bare feet on the polished floorboards beside the chair. Her dress was dark, a deep wine almost black in the candlelight, less formal than the previous evening. Her sleeves were longer, the neckline less deliberate, and her hair had been put up loosely for convenience rather than display. In one hand she held a glass of dark rum, neat, with no concessions to the preferences of guests who might find it strong. She looked relaxed. On Annie Palmer, relaxation was the most alarming thing Robert had yet seen, because he understood with that animal instinct running ahead of reason that it was a choice. She had put it on as deliberately as she had put on the crimson dress the night before. She had decided to appear unarmored, which meant she was more armored than ever, in a different kind of armor entirely. Annie asked him to sit, indicating a second chair drawn close enough to the small table between them to suggest conversation without requiring proximity. She offered rum and added that she suspected he would need it, though perhaps not for the reason he thought. Robert sat and accepted the rum she poured from the decanter on the table. He looked around the room, at the books, the objects, and the skull with its mirror eyes, and understood that she had chosen to let him see all of it. This room, which surely very few people at Rose Hall had ever entered by invitation, was part of the evening's design. She was showing him something. Whether it was the truth of her, a selected presentation of the truth, or a deliberately constructed fiction designed to produce a specific effect, he could not yet determine. Robert observed that she read widely. Annie replied that she read everything. There was nothing else to do at Rose Hall after dark, she said, unless one preferred the alternatives. Her eyes moved briefly to the window and the darkness beyond it, and the implied suggestion of what might wait in that darkness was worse than anything she might have said plainly. Then, with sudden ease, she asked him about London and whether he had grown up there. The shift was so sudden and complete that Robert took a moment to follow it. She was asking about London, leaning forward slightly with that deliberate, chosen warmth, her eyes on him with the full force of extraordinary attention. Whatever Annie Palmer did, she did with her entire self. There was no division in her, no part of her mind elsewhere. When she looked, a person was truly looked at. Robert told her about London, his father's comfortable but unranned house in Islington, his study of law at the inns, and the city itself, its grey urgency, its endless motion, the way 5 million people produced a sound that was not noise but weather. A permanent atmospheric condition of human life, commerce, suffering, and ambition compressed into 20 square miles. She listened. That was remarkable. Most people listen to conversation the way they listen to music in a room where they are doing something else, aware of it, occasionally marking a passage of interest, but not truly attending. Annie listened the way a musician listens, with her whole body, hearing the structure of things as well as their surface. Her questions revealed that she had heard not only what Robert said, but why he said it, what it disclosed, and what it carefully concealed. She suggested, placidly and without judgment, that Robert liked the law because it was a system of agreed fictions, stories society tells itself about what is real, what is owed, and who is permitted what. He found it interesting, she said, that reality could be negotiated. Robert began to object that the law was structured rather than fictional. Annie replied that of course he would call it structured. That was what made it useful. The best fictions, she said with a brief exact smile, are the ones people take for granted. She refilled Robert's glass without being asked. Then she rose from her chair, unhurried, barefoot, moving through the candlelit room with the quality of someone entirely at home in her own gravity, and went to the bookshelves. Her fingers passed along the spines with a lover's familiarity until she found what she wanted, a slender, dark-covered volume marked in faded gold lettering he could not read from where he sat. Annie asked whether he minded if she read to him. The poem was in Haitian Creole, she explained, and she would translate as she went, though the translation would be imperfect. The original, she said, was always better. All originals were always better. She opened the book to a page she found without looking, as though she knew it by touch. It was about love, or what people called love, or what devoured them and allowed them to call it love so they could keep living. She read. Her voice in Haitian Creole was a different instrument than her voice in English, lower, more musical, with a rhythm English did not have, a cadence that felt ancient and organic, the sound of a language built by people living close to both the earth and the divine. She read a stanza, then looked up and translated, her English rendering catching the sense of it faithfully while losing, as she had warned, the heat of the original. The poem was about desire as a form of consumption, the way love, in its most honest form, takes without asking permission, the way it hollows a person out from the inside with a hunger that feels, while it is happening, indistinguishable from fullness. The beloved became both nourishment and poison, both harbor and storm. Intelligent, careful, self-possessed people walked toward this knowledge with their eyes open and were destroyed by it anyway, because knowing the nature of fire does not make anyone proof against burning. At the last line, Annie paused over the Creole, letting it pass silently through her before rendering it into English. Approximately, she said, it meant she had not chosen to love. She had chosen only to look, and looking had been enough. Annie closed the book but did not look at Robert immediately. The poet, she explained, had been a woman who outlived everyone she loved, died very old and very alone, and remained certain, by all accounts, that she had lived the only life worth living. Robert observed that those seemed like irreconcilable conclusions. Annie answered that most true things were irreconcilable. That was how one knew they were true. She set the book on the table between them and noted that most men came to Rose Hall expecting to manage something, the land, the numbers, and, after a perfectly weighted pause, her. The candlelight moved, a draft from somewhere inside the thick stone walls, making the flames lean and shiver. The bird skull's mirror eyes scattered light across the ceiling in brief, bright constellations. The room smelled of rum, old paper, jasmine, and beneath all of it, that darker scent Robert could not name, the one that had threaded through Rose Hall since his arrival like a sentence he could not quite complete. Annie told Mr. Ashworth that no one managed her. She said it without anger, without emphasis, without the self-conscious performance of a woman making a declaration. She said it with the absolute calm of stating a geographical fact, as one might say, without drama, that the ocean is deep or the mountain is old. She refilled his glass. She sat. They talked further about the island, about Jamaica's history as Annie understood it, layered and complicated and told from the position of someone who occupied a strange and singular place within it, too Haitian for the English planters, too European for the workers in the fields, too powerful for anyone to categorize comfortably. She spoke about power the way other people speak about weather, as a condition of existence rather than an achievement, something one navigates rather than pursues. At some point, Robert could not be certain when, because time had taken on the strange quality it has in fear, happiness, or the presence of something that does not obey ordinary rules, Annie moved her chair. Not dramatically. She simply shifted closer in the natural course of conversation, the way people do when intimacy makes the distance across a table feel like an obstacle. It was entirely natural. It was entirely deliberate. Both things were true at once, and she knew it, and she knew Robert knew it, and none of that changed the fact that his awareness of the room narrowed to the 6 inches of air between her shoulder and his. She was warm. That surprised him again after the cool precision of her hand at dinner the night before. She radiated warmth the way the old stone walls of Rose Hall radiated the heat they had absorbed all day, the warmth of something that had taken in a great deal and now gave it back in the dark. Robert was aware of all of it with awful, crystalline clarity, her closeness, the patient work of the rum, the patient work of the candlelight, and the work Annie herself was doing without assistance from either. She was, quite simply, the most compelling thing he had ever been near, and that quality in her was both genuine and weaponized. Knowing it was weaponized made no practical difference to any part of him. He did not kiss her. Not out of honor alone, though he wanted honor to be somewhere in the picture, but because he understood with that same animal instinct that had outrun reason all day that she did not want him to. Not yet. Whatever game this was, that was not the move she had chosen for the evening, and she was far too expert a player to be moved off her own board. Then she leaned closer, slowly and deliberately, until he could feel the warmth of her breath against his jaw, until the smell of her, jasmine, rum, and that dark beneath thing became the entire atmosphere of the room. Her lips came near his ear, near enough that the distance between them and his skin was hardly a distance at all. She gave him one word, soon. One word, spoken softly, not whispered, but soft, with a specificity of intention that made it land like something physical. Then she straightened with no sign of disturbance or consequence, reached for the decanter, and offered more rum with the serenity of a woman at a perfectly ordinary social occasion. Annie noted that it was getting late and that he would want his rest. The estate was demanding in the mornings, and she suspected he had more to review in the ledgers than he had found that day. After a brief, measuring glance, she added that she had enjoyed the evening more than expected, which was itself unusual. Robert answered that he had enjoyed it as well, more than, then stopped himself, deciding that finishing the sentence was not in his interests. He thanked her for the rum and the poetry. Annie told him to thank her for the poetry. The rum, she said, was merely hospitality. Her eyes held his for one precise moment, long enough to be intentional, not long enough to be readable, and then she wished him good night. Robert left the study. He walked back through the candlelit corridor with its tracking portraits and its darkness between the sconces. He descended the stair, crossed the lower hall, went up to his room, closed the door behind him, and stood with his back against it for a moment in the dark, listening to himself breathe. His hands were shaking. In the dim light from the window, a three-quarter moon over the Caribbean flooding the shutters with silver, he watched them tremble and could not honestly have said whether it came from fear, desire, or the electric aftermath of being close to something his body knew was unsafe and wanted all the same. He could not tell which of them was winning. What she left behind. Robert lit his candle, opened his journal on the desk, uncapped his pen, and sat before the blank page until he understood that he would not write anything. Some states of mind make language inadequate, not because words are absent, but because the thing that needs describing lives precisely between them, in the spaces language cannot reach. He sat with the pen in his hand and the blank page before him. Eventually, he set the pen down and went to the window. The smell reached him first. Jasmine. Distinct and unmistakable, her perfume, or the gardens, or by now he could no longer separate them, drifted through the window shutters on air that was otherwise only the warm, salt-edged night air of the Jamaican coast. He stood at the window and told himself it was the garden and the wind and nothing more remarkable than that. He was still telling himself this when he turned from the window and saw what lay on his pillow. A playing card lay face up in the precise center of his pillow, oriented toward him with the particularity of something placed rather than dropped, positioned rather than left. The Queen of Spades. Robert stood and looked at it for a long moment before crossing the room and picking it up. He held it in both hands, carefully, as though its condition might be fragile, though it appeared to be an entirely ordinary playing card in every visible respect. He had not put it there. That was not a question of memory or uncertainty. He had unpacked his bags himself upon arrival, had no cards among his possessions, and had made his own bed that morning. The pillow had been bare. The door to his room had been locked from the inside. He had locked it himself. Of that, he was certain. He turned the card over. On the back on the plain, unprinted back that should have shown only the card's pattern, someone had written in red ink. The ink was fresh. He knew it because, when he brought the card close to the candle to read it, the light revealed the faintest surface sheen, not quite dry, slightly tacky at the edges of the letters. It had been written and placed not long before he entered the room. The hand was precise, familiar from the note Mabel had brought on the silver tray. There was a single word. A name, perhaps in Haitian Creole or something older than Haitian Creole. Robert would not have dared to render it in his journal, uncertain of its exact spelling and, by now, uncertain what writing it might do. He did not know whose name it was, or whether it was a name at all, or whether names, in the context of Annie Palmer and the things she knew, meant what they meant elsewhere. He looked at it for a long time. Then he closed his hand around the card and went to find Taku. He found Taku the next morning at dawn, at the well on the western edge of the great house grounds, a low stone well, ancient, covered with a wooden frame worn smooth by decades of hands. Taku was there alone, drawing water in the gray-blue light of first dawn, and he looked up as Robert crossed the duet grass with the absolute unsurprise of a man who had been expecting exactly this visitor at exactly this moment for some time. Robert held out the card. Taku took it in one large, weathered hand, without being asked, and studied it. He looked at the queen on the face, then at what was written on the back. His expression did not change, not at the writing, not at the fresh red ink, not at the unknown word. He looked at it for a long time, and then he did something Robert had not anticipated. Taku carried it to the lantern hanging from the well's frame, a small oil-burning lantern. Its glass smoked from the night's burning, and held the card to the flame until it caught. He kept it there until there was nothing left to hold, then released the last of it and let the ash take the morning air. He did this without asking permission, with the efficiency of a man destroying something that needed to be destroyed before it had time to become anything else. Then Taku looked at Robert. His eyes, in the dawn light, belonged to a man who had understood the world at a depth most people never reach and had paid, over a long life, every price that understanding exacts. There was knowledge in them that made everything Robert had read in those ledgers feel very small and very new. Taku told him that Annie was deciding whether to keep him. The ash of the card rose in a small, brief spiral on the morning air and was gone. Taku told him to pray she decided yes. The ones she released, he warned, did not leave well. He looked at Robert steadily, without apology and without softening. Then Taku picked up his bucket and walked away across the dew-wet grass toward the cane fields, toward whatever his morning held, with the unhurried purpose of a man who had said what needed saying and would not be adding to it. Robert stood at the well in the early morning light of Rose Hall. The sun was just beginning to rise over the eastern hills, painting everything gold and then white, and the cane moved in the first breath of morning wind off the sea with a sound like low voices, like the rustling of a great and patient crowd. The jasmine smell was everywhere, in the garden, on the air, and faintly, impossibly, still on his jacket from the night before. He thought about Dunmore. Brown hair gone white in 3 days, body upright in a chapel pew with the absolute composure of a dead man. He thought about the crosses in the ledger, too regular, too quiet, too scheduled. He thought about the word on the card, written in red ink still tacky from Annie's pen. He thought about what Taku had said, and the weight given to the word releases, and the fact that the card had been burned without question, because some things should not remain in the world longer than necessary. And then, because the mind is a defiant and sometimes treasonous instrument, he thought about the warmth of Annie in the candlelit study, the sound of her voice reading Haitian poetry in the night, and the word she had placed against his ear like a promise or a sentence. Soon, Robert stood in the early morning light of Rose Hall, listening to the cane fields breathe in the wind, and for the first time, with a clarity he could no longer argue himself out of, he truly wondered whether he would ever leave this place at all. Somewhere beneath that fear, like a coal beneath cold ash, something still burned. He was not entirely certain he wanted to. You have been listening to The White Witch of Rose Hall Episode 2, The Mistress. She is closer now. The spell is tightening. The line between desire and danger grows thinner in the Jamaican heat. Next, Robert is drawn into the estate's darkest secrets. A ritual in the cane fields. a price not yet named. And Annie Palmer, at last, shows him something real. Episode 3, The Ritual, coming next.